Have you ever wondered how our ancestors lived and what they bought in medieval England? When there were no shopping centers, online stores, or credit cards? How did they get everything they needed to live? We are used to abundance and instant access to goods, but are we ready to imagine a world where every purchase was a complex ritual and the choice was extremely limited? Get ready to immerse yourself in a world where trading was inseparable from the daily struggle for survival, and the peasant, going to the market, did not just shop, but participated in the ancient dance of exchange, trust, and survival. Watch this video until the end to find out why their archaic trading methods can give us important lessons about the value of things and the true nature of the economy. For most medieval peasants, the main places to shop were local markets and periodic fairs. Markets were usually held once or twice a week in designated locations in cities or large villages. These days were marked in the farmer's calendar as important milestones that required careful preparation. Villagers woke up long before Ruswet to catch the market, sometimes walking for tens of kilometers on muddy and bumpy roads that often turned into impenetrable mess after the rains. They carried their wares, surplus crops, livestock, handicrafts in large wicker baskets, on the backs of donkeys or even on their own. These were not just trading platforms, but real social centers where people not only sold and bought, but also exchanged news, gossip, made deals, met distant relatives, and even looked for a couple. The market was a living organism, pulsing with life and energy. At the market, you could buy everything necessary for a modest peasant life, from grain, wheat, barley, rye, oats, vegetables, cabbage, onions, carrots, legumes, and fruits, if the season allowed, to the simplest tools, hoes, sickles, shovels, pottery, salt, vital but an expensive product for conservation, and a few fabrics, coarse cloth, linen. An important role was played by the products of artisans, who often had their own shops or dedicated places in the market. Blacksmiths sold not only tools but also horseshoes, nails, and door hinges. Weavers offered homespun cloth of various densities and colors, while shoemakers offered simple but durable leather shoes. Trade was often conducted directly from the ground, where goods were laid out on mats or hides, or from simple wooden tables that each merchant brought with him. There were no fixed price tags. The price was determined by long and sometimes fierce bargaining, which could last quite a long time. Sellers and buyers actively gesticulated, argued loudly, trying to get the best price, and the process itself was noisy, chaotic, and filled with emotional outbursts. The atmosphere in the market was far removed from modern ideas about hygiene. The smell of animals, manure, rotting waste, sweat, and crowds of people created an unforgettable, penetrating ambergris, and flies and other insects were constant companions of the trade. Fairs were much larger and held much less frequently, usually once a year or several times a year, timed to coincide with major religious holidays or significant events such as harvesting. They lasted for several days or even weeks and were real economic and cultural phenomena. Fairs brought together merchants from more remote regions, as well as merchants from abroad, becoming the most important hubs of international trade. At fairs, you could find goods that were not available in ordinary markets, which made them especially attractive for farmers who saved up money and waited for this event. Among such goods were expensive and fine fabrics. Such goods were expensive and fine fabrics, silk from China, brocade from Byzantium, exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, jewelry. Although they were not available to the peasantry, they could be bought by the well-to-do segments of the population. Weapons, swords, armor, and other luxury items. For farmers, the fair was not only a chance to buy what they really needed or sell the surplus to earn some cash, but also a grand spectacle, a source of entertainment and new experiences. Traveling artists, jugglers, kanta muses performed here, and you could taste food and drinks that were not found in ordinary life. However, for all their significance and festive atmosphere, how safe were these places for shopping? Were theft, fraud, and robbery not commonplace in such congested areas of people and goods? How could farmers protect their few savings and goods in such a chaotic and potentially dangerous environment where everyone could fall victim to crooked dealers or robbers? If you want to know the answer to this question, Watch this video to the end. Security at markets and fairs was a constant concern. Crowds of people attracted not only honest merchants and buyers, but also numerous thieves, pickpockets, and swindlers. Farmers who came with cash or valuable goods were easy targets. In order to somehow protect the gray area, people tried to stay in groups, not to show their money or the most valuable goods openly. Money was often sewn into clothing or hidden in secret pouches. However, theft was common, and many returned home robbed. Fraud also flourished. Unscrupulous merchants could mix in low-quality products, overweight customers, or sell fake goods. For example, spices could be diluted with cheap fillers, and fabrics could have hidden defects. Protection from such practices was minimal. Sometimes there were market courts or guild elders to settle disputes and punish those responsible, but their effectiveness was highly dependent on location and time. Often the peasant's only protection was his reputation in the community and his trust in the merchants he knew, with whom he did business from year to year. But even that didn't always guarantee complete security in the swirling world of medieval commerce. In conditions of limited coin circulation, especially in rural areas, barter, in-kind exchange, it was the cornerstone of the medieval peasant economy. The money supply was extremely small, and coins were often in short supply and were intended mainly for paying feudal duties, taxes, or buying very expensive goods. For this reason, most small and medium-sized transactions between farmers, and sometimes with artisans, were carried out by direct exchange of goods and services. The peasants exchanged their surplus produce grain, eggs, milk, honey, vegetables, fruits, and meat, especially those salted for the winter, for what they needed but couldn't produce themselves or ran out of time. For example, a farmer who had a good wheat crop could exchange a few sacks of grain for a pair of new boots from a shoemaker, who, in turn, needed grain to feed his family. Or he could give the carpenter a dozen eggs, a bag of offal cards, and some butter in exchange for fixing the roof of his barn or making a new wooden tool. The milkman could exchange his cheese, butter, or cottage cheese for the services of a blacksmith in sharpening tools or making a small door bracket. This was a complex process that required not only an understanding of the real value of each product based on its utility and labor costs, but also a deep trust between the exchange participants. Often the exchange was multi-stage. To get the right product, you first had to exchange your product for something else, which in turn was in demand from the one who possessed the desired thing. For example, to get woolen cloth, a farmer could first exchange his vegetables for grain, then the grain for animal skins, and only then the skins for cloth if the weaver needed them. The barter system created close social ties and interdependence within the community. Neighbors helped each other by exchanging not only goods, but also labor, which formed a powerful network of informal obligations and mutual services. Entire networks of informal obligations were formed, where everyone knew who could be useful, in what way, and who owed what to whom. For example, assistance in harvesting crops could be paid for with a portion of the grain collected or with assistance in other activities. However, this system also had significant drawbacks. It was extremely inflexible and depended on matching needs. You had to find someone who wanted exactly what you had and offered exactly what you needed. This could be very difficult, especially for rare or specific items that only a limited number of people needed. In addition, storing and transporting large quantities of goods for exchange was difficult, and there was also a risk of spoilage of perishable products, which made bartering less effective over long distances or over long periods of time. But what if the right product was not available in the nearest community, and you had to go on a long journey where strangers might not be so honest or their needs did not coincide with your offers? How were exchange and security issues dealt with when the trust on which all barter was based was absent and written contracts did not exist? Find out the answer in the next section. Barter risks and ways to minimize them. The lack of a single equivalent of value, money, made barter susceptible to fraud. The definition of a fair exchange rate has been the subject of constant debate and negotiation. For example, how many eggs did one chicken leg cost? And how much milk for a new pillow? This required the peasants to have developed bargaining skills and the ability to assess the real value of goods. To minimize risks, farmers tried to trade with those they knew and trusted. Reputation was extremely important. A dishonest merchant was quickly remembered and avoided, which could lead to his ruin. Ali was shunned, which could lead to his ruin. Communities had informal control mechanisms where elders or respected members of the community could mediate disputes. In addition, there was a problem of transportation and storage. If a farmer wanted to exchange a large amount of grain for something else, he had to first transport the grain and then perhaps the goods received in exchange. It was time-consuming and dangerous, especially on the roads where robbers were lurking. Barter, despite its primitiveness, was a complex but vital system that was based on trust, mutual assistance, and strong social ties. In medieval England, peasants were forced to rely heavily on home production and self-sufficiency. Life was harsh, full of hardships and dangers, and each peasant household was essentially a small, self-sufficient economic unit. The goal was the same: to meet their basic needs as much as possible at the expense of their own labor and resources, since access to foreign markets was limited and money was scarce. This meant that the vast majority of necessities, from food to clothing to the simplest tools, were produced by family members themselves, often using primitive techniques and a huge amount of manual labor. Food came first and was the foundation of life. Farmers grew various types of grain crops: wheat, barley, rye, oats, which served as the basis of their diet in the form of bread and cereals. In addition to grains, they cultivated vegetables: cabbage, onions, carrots, garlic, legumes, turnips, that provided vitamins and variety in a lean diet. Livestock was raised. Chickens provided eggs and meat. Pigs were unpretentious and provided plenty of meat that could be salted or smoked for the winter. And cows and sheep provided milk, wool, and draft power. Women played a key role in food processing. They made bread in home ovens, cooked porridges, salted meat and fish, made cheese and butter, and collected wild berries, mushrooms, and herbs that supplemented the diet and served as medicine. Clothing was also entirely the product of domestic labor. Peasant women spun wool from their own sheep and then wove coarse but very strong and warm linen on primitive wooden looms. After that, they sewed simple, functional clothes for the whole family: tuniki, dresses, pants, capes. The clothing was layered to better protect from the cold and was worn until it was completely worn out. Mending and reworking old clothes was common, as every thread counted, and new clothes were rarely sewn except when needed or for special occasions. The dyes were natural, derived from plants, so the colors were muted and subdued. Even some tools and household items were made independently or with the help of local craftsmen. Baskets were woven from willow twigs. Wooden utensils, spoons, bowls, ladles, were carved from wood, and the simplest furniture, tables, benches, beds, was assembled from improvised materials. Only the most complex or highly specialized items, such as metal tools, plows, axes, knives, ceramic tableware, or high-quality leather shoes, were purchased at the market or exchanged with artisans. This approach to life was not just an economy, but the only way to survive in the face of limited resources and lack of mass production. It required a huge amount of time, physical labor, and a variety of specialized skills passed down from generation to generation. But at the same time, it gave farmers a certain degree of independence from external factors and trade networks, making them more resilient to crises. However, how effective was this system in the face of unpredictable weather, frequent nuisances, and epidemics? How did farmers cope with the risk of starvation when their own production could not provide enough food? And what measures did they take to avoid starving to death in the most difficult times? The life of a medieval peasant was inextricably linked to the feudal system, which determined his place in society and the economy. Most peasants did not own the land they worked on, but rented it from a lord, a representative of the nobility or the church, in exchange for labor and duties known as rent. This tax could be either in the form of a share of the harvest, for example, a tithe or a quarter of the grain collected, or in the form of work on the lord's land, the so-called corvée, which sometimes took up to several days a week. The peasants were attached to the land and could not leave it without the lord's permission, making them practically his property. However, the role of the feudal lord was not limited to collecting tribute. He could also act as a kind of supplier or creditor, often using his monopoly position to further enrich and strengthen control over the peasant population. Farmers were often forced to buy certain goods or services from the lord or his steward, because the lord had exclusive rights to certain activities or owned key resources. For example, a lord could own the only mill in the area, and the peasants had to pay for the grinding of grain, either a share of the grain, the so-called flour tax, or a small amount of money. The same went for the bread ovens that the lord owned, or the grape and apple presses if they were available on the manor. This was a kind of monopoly position that the lord used to generate additional profits, guaranteeing himself a stable income regardless of the yield on the peasant allotments. These payments were mandatory and often significant for the peasant budget, reducing the already modest reserves. Sometimes a lord would lend farmers seeds for planting, agricultural tools, or even livestock, which would then have to be paid off with a portion of the crop or labor, often at an inflated price or at an unprofitable interest rate, which further tied the peasants to the landowner. This system had both advantages and significant disadvantages. On the one hand, it provided farmers with access to essential goods and services that they could not otherwise obtain, since they did not have their own mills, furnaces, or the means to purchase expensive tools. The lord, therefore, assumed part of the functions of the state, providing infrastructure. On the other hand, it created a constant dependence on the lord and could lead to severe exploitation. Peasants often found themselves in debt bondage, from which it was extremely difficult to get out, which further aggravated their situation and limited their personal and economic freedom. Debts could last for years and sometimes even decades, passed down from generation to generation. Under such a system, were the Ye peasants completely deprived of their freedom of choice and doomed to endless dependence on the whims of the feudal lord? How could they survive if the lord was excessively greedy or unfair, imposing exorbitant taxes and duties, and whether there were any mechanisms to protect them from the arbitrariness of the feudal lord? If you want to find out how the peasants resisted or tried to adapt to such conditions, watch this video to the end. Mechanisms of survival and adaptation of peasants in the conditions of feudal dependence. Despite the strict system, the peasants were not completely defenseless. There were some restrictions on the arbitrariness of the lord, due both to ordinary law and the need to maintain the minimum viability of peasant farms. Excessive exploitation could lead to mass starvation, uprisings, or fleeing peasants, which was also unprofitable for the lord himself, since without labor, his land lost its value. Peasants could apply for protection to the communal court, or even to the king in cases of obvious injustice, although such cases were rare and required considerable courage. Excessive exploitation could lead to mass starvation, uprisings, or fleeing peasants, which was also unprofitable for the lord himself, since without labor, his land lost its value. Peasants could apply for protection to the communal court, or even to the king in cases of obvious injustice, although such cases were rare and required considerable courage. However, in most cases, their survival depended on their ability to manage their farms as efficiently as possible, minimize losses, and look for opportunities for additional earnings or exchanges in order to pay all their taxes and keep at least something for themselves. In addition to local markets and major fairs, itinerant merchants and peddlers, or peddlers, played a significant and sometimes decisive role in providing the peasantry with goods, or peddlers. These enterprising people were real road travelers, traveling between villages and hamlets, covering huge distances on bad roads that could be impassable in mud or in winter. They offered products that were difficult to find in local markets, produced independently or that were needed in small quantities. These merchants were a kind of mobile shops on their feet, carrying with them not only goods, but also news, rumors, gossip, and information from remote regions, becoming for the peasants the only window to a large, distant world. Peddlers could sell a wide variety of goods, often those that were small in volume, but valuable. These could be exotic spices, salt, a vital product for preserving meat and fish, which was rarely produced in the hinterland, needles, thread, buttons, braid, cheap jewelry, beads, rings, medicinal herbs, potions, amulets, and sometimes small handicrafts such as hair combs, simple jewelry, etc., knives, scissors, or whetstones. They carried their wares in large bags, bulky wicker baskets, or on special trays strapped to their backs or necks. Payment could be made either in coins, if the peasant had cash, or by barter, which made their services particularly valuable to those who did not have cash. They often accepted eggs, cheese, yarn, fur, poultry, or other household products as payment. The appearance of a traveling merchant in the village was a real event that broke the monotony of peasant life. He brought with him not only goods, but also a piece of the outside world, told about events in other cities and countries, shared rumors and news, which sometimes were the only source of information for isolated communities. Often the peddlers were also storytellers, entertaining the peasants for a small fee or in exchange for food and a night's lodging. However, how reliable were these merchants? Were there no swindlers and deceivers among them who took advantage of the naivete of the peasants, selling them low-quality goods at inflated prices, diluting spices, replacing expensive metals with cheap alloys, or selling cheap fakes under the guise of valuable items? And how could the peasants be convinced of the integrity of such a seller, whom they could only meet once every few months, without being able to check his reputation or complain about him to the local authorities if he was an outsider? You will find out the answer to these questions, as well as how they work, by watching this video to the end. Fraud protection and specific relationships with peddlers. In the absence of legal consumer protection, farmers relied on their oral reputation and personal experience. If the peddler cheated, a bad name quickly spread about him, and the next time he was simply not allowed to enter the village. Therefore, many merchants tried to maintain a good reputation in order to ensure a constant route and clientele. They offered small samples, gave the opportunity to carefully inspect the goods. However, the risk of cheating was always present, especially for those who lived in remote areas and had no alternative. Peddlers were also exposed to dangers. They often became victims of robbers on the roads as they transported valuable goods and cash. Their life was full of risks, but at the same time it gave them a certain freedom and earning opportunities that were not available to the peasants. For the peasants, these merchants were not just vendors, but important links to the outside world, providing access to vital goods and bringing news from outside their small community. In medieval peasant society, credit and debt were an integral part of economic life, much more common than one might imagine. The lack of stable cash flow, dependence on unpredictable factors such as weather, crop yields, livestock diseases, and the constant threat of famine, epidemics, or war made short-term borrowing commonplace and often vital. Farmers borrowed each other's grain until the next harvest, tools for sowing or reaping, or even services and labor when needed. These informal credit relationships were deeply rooted in the fabric of community life. Usury existed, although it was condemned by the church, which strictly forbade charging interest on money, considering it a sin, especially for Christians. However, there were loopholes. Instead of interest, they could take additional goods or labor. Some wealthy landowners, merchants, or even Jewish communities, for which the ban on usury between Jews did not apply to Christians, could lend money at interest rates that were often extremely high, which quickly drove the debtors into even greater poverty. However, most often the loan was informal and based on trust relationships within the community and on personal connections. For example, a farmer could get the necessary seeds from a wealthier neighbor, promising to return them with interest after harvesting or work out this amount in his field. Alternatively, he could receive goods from a local artisan on loan, committing to work it out later, for example, helping in the blacksmith shop, or return the products of his farm, for example, a few eggs or a piece of cheese. Sometimes these were debts of honor that were written down on wooden sticks with notches, so-called counting sticks or tallies, or simply stored in memory, passed down by word of mouth. The credit system was vital for survival, especially in difficult times when crops were lost, livestock were sick, or there were unexpected expenses, for example, for funerals or weddings. It allowed the peasants to survive critical periods and continue their economic activities. But it was also a source of constant financial pressure and dependency. Debts could accumulate and be passed down, and entire families would find themselves in debt bondage for generations, working for their lender for food and shelter. This created an almost insurmountable circle of poverty and dependence, from which it was extremely difficult to get out. Were there no ways out of this vicious circle of debt? Or were the peasants doomed to perpetual poverty and dependence? And how did the community react to those who were unable or unwilling to pay their debts? And what social consequences did this entail? The church played a huge role in the life of medieval peasants, penetrating into all spheres of their existence, not only in the spiritual, but also in the economic, social, and even political. In that era, the church was not just a religious institution, but a powerful landowner, owning vast territories, villages, and resources. Monasteries, bishoprics, and parishes were actually major economic centers, as well as the most important centers of charity and education. During famine years, during devastating epidemics, such as the Black Death, or during periods of war when government assistance was lacking or extremely limited, the church often served as the only source of hope and support for the destitute. She could distribute food, bread, stew made from grains and vegetables, clothing made in the monastery workshops or donated by rich parishioners, or other basic necessities to the most needy members of the community. In addition to these direct forms of assistance, ecclesiastical institutions often maintained hospices for pilgrims and beggars, providing them with temporary shelter and food. These hospitalers were among the few who offered structured care, albeit on a limited scale. Their role was critical, as they not only offered food and shelter, but also provided affordable medical care, which was often the only one available to many people. Often, pilgrim houses were located along the main pilgrimage routes, providing support for travelers who might get lost or sick on the way. The monasteries also cultivated medicinal herbs and had a certain knowledge of primitive medicine, which allowed them to provide first aid or ease the suffering of the sick. In some cases, they even took in orphaned or abandoned children, providing them with shelter and upbringing, which was another form of social protection in the absence of state guardianship. Moreover, church shelters often served as shelters for widows and elderly people who could not rely on the support of their families or communities. These institutions, although modest by modern standards, were a vital element of the social infrastructure of the time, providing at least some support for those who were on the verge of survival. The peasants, in turn, paid tithes to the church, a mandatory tax that amounted to 1/10 of their annual crop or income. It was not only a religious custom, but also an economic one, fixed by law and deeply ingrained in the minds of the people. These funds raised by the church, in addition to maintaining the pre-clergy, building and maintaining numerous churches, as well as conducting complex religious rites, were partly used to help the poor and destitute, in accordance with the Christian principles of charity and charity. Monasteries often had their own extensive farms, which were highly productive and could produce significant surpluses of grain, vegetables, meat, and dairy products thanks to improved farming methods and labor management. They actively applied crop rotation, used more advanced plows and irrigation systems, which allowed them to get yields that often surpassed those of the peasants. The Benedictine monks, for example, were known for their agricultural innovation and ability to turn uncultivated land into fertile land. In times of crisis, these supplies were distributed among the peasants, acting as a kind of insurance fund or a reserve source of food when the peasants' own supplies were depleted. Monks could also provide temporary shelter and care for the sick, serving as a kind of first hospitals and shelters where, although at a primitive level, medical care was provided and care was provided. These monastic infirmaries were often the only places where you could get any qualified help, because knowledge about hygiene and treatment was extremely limited in the world. Some monasteries even maintained libraries containing medical treatises copied by monks, which helped preserve and transmit knowledge through generations. Among other things, monasteries often acted as creditors, lending farmers grain or seeds in exchange for a promise to repay the debt after the harvest, which helped maintain the agricultural cycle and prevent impoverishment in lean years. This financial involvement of the church in the life of the peasantry demonstrated its deep integration into the economic structure of society. Most goods in the Middle Ages were produced by artisans not on a mass scale, but to order. A peasant who needed a new plow, or pot, or pair of boots would go directly to the blacksmith, potter, or shoemaker. This process took time and required an individual approach. A blacksmith could make a plow from the iron provided by the peasant or from his own stock, but the forging process was time-consuming. The potter sculpted the dishes by hand and then fired them in the oven, which also took time. The shoemaker took measurements from the foot and then sewed on a shoe, often made of leather, which the customer could bring himself. The payment could be either monetary or in kind. Sometimes a peasant worked for a craftsman to pay for an order. Such a system provided high-quality products, but limited availability and required patience. It was impossible to just go and buy something ready-made at any time. Everything was planned in advance, and you had to wait until the order was completed. This was the exact opposite of the modern consumer society. However, how much could the farmers trust the quality of these handcrafted goods, and how could they be sure that their order would be completed on time? In the medieval peasant economy, accumulation and saving looked completely different than today. There were no banks, and it was not safe to keep money in the house. Therefore, the peasants saved their resources in the form of natural assets. The main method of accumulation was surplus grain. If the harvest was good, part of the grain was set aside not only for sowing the next year, but also for sale on the market or for exchange. It was a kind of investment fund that could be used in difficult times. Cattle also played a role of savings. A cow, a pig, or a few sheep were valuable assets that could be sold or exchanged for the desired goods or services. Some farmers were able to accumulate precious metal if they had the opportunity, small coins or jewelry that could be used in an emergency. However, this was rare. The bulk of the savings remained in the form of food and livestock. But how safe was it to keep such savings in the face of constant wars, raids, and theft? How could the peasants protect their supplies from hungry neighbors or robbers? And did they not put themselves in even greater danger by having these valuables? In addition to all the methods described above, social ties and mutual assistance within the community played a key role in the purchases and survival of medieval peasant social ties and mutual assistance. It was a kind of informal economy based on trust, solidarity, and mutual support. Neighbors exchanged labor. They helped each other during sowing and reaping, built houses, and repaired buildings. In the event of illness or misfortune, the entire community came to the rescue, providing food, care, or financial support, albeit in kind. This social capital was no less and sometimes even more valuable than material resources. Such a system of mutual aid was vital for survival in the harsh Middle Ages. It created a sense of community and belonging, and also served as a kind of safety net in the event of personal or general disasters. However, how stable was this system in the face of conflicts and personal disagreements? Were there no people who took advantage of the generosity of others? And how did the community deal with such freeloaders? If you want to learn how medieval society maintained a balance between mutual aid and justice, watch this video to the end. Thus, the purchases of medieval English peasants were a complex and multifaceted process, far removed from our modern consumer experience. They were based on in-kind exchange, domestic production, local markets, dependence on the feudal lord, the services of traveling merchants, informal credit, church charity, individual orders from artisans, accumulation in the form of grain and livestock, as well as other social ties and mutual assistance. Their lives were a constant struggle for survival, where every resource was worth its weight in gold, and every purchase was the result of careful planning and often hard work. This system, despite its apparent primitiveness, was extremely adaptive and stable in the absence of developed infrastructure and technologies. The peasants intuitively understood the principles of rational use of resources, the value of labor, and the importance of community connections. Perhaps we, the people of the 21st century, should learn from them this incredible resilience, ingenuity, and ability to survive in the harshest conditions. Their experience is not just a history lesson, but a reminder of how dependent we are on modern systems and how fragile our comfort can be. If this video made you think about our roots, about the real price of goods, and how people lived before us, if you were able to watch it to the end, despite all the complexity and sometimes severity of the topic, be sure to subscribe to our channel so as not to miss other exciting and sometimes shocking stories about the past, which they will change your idea of the world. And please tell us in the comments, which of these medieval shopping methods surprised you the most and why? Your feedback is very important to us.